Dr. Celine Marie Pascale is an Associate Dean of Undergraduate Studies, College of Arts and Sciences at American University in Washington, D.C., as well as Professor of Sociology and Affiliate Professor for the School of Communications. She studies language research to examine issues of culture, knowledge, and power. I first became aware of her and her work when ENEnews.com ran a story about a paper she presented at the International Sociological Association's World Congress last year. She covered aspects of the media coverage of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster that those of us in this movement suspected and complained about, but we couldn't prove it. She, however, did more than 2 years of analysis and came up with the data to prove the points, especially the framing of the concept of risk to people after Fukushima. I was very excited to track her down at her office in D.C. and interview her for this show. Celine Marie Pascale, welcome to Nuclear Hot Seat.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start out with giving the listeners a sense of your background.
I'm a sociologist at American University, and I'm interested in issues of language and knowledge. I study language use to understand the kinds of assumptions that people make in their daily lives that often reproduce systems of inequality.
What first got you interested in studying media coverage that took place in the wake of the start of the Fukushima nuclear disaster?
I began noticing in my own casual reading that the media didn't cover the nuclear disaster in ways that I might have expected. And a little bit like what happened after Hurricane Katrina, that there was a way of reporting the natural disaster that really minimized what was going on and the social decisions that created the disaster itself around the levees. And so I wondered if something like that was happening with Fukushima. It seems like we weren't getting quite the whole story.
From my perspective and that of people in the movement, we couldn't agree with you more. When did you start turning this into research, and how did you proceed?
2 years after the disaster, I began collecting newspaper articles, media coverage from the Huffington Post, Politico, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. I collected everything that they had printed about Fukushima in the 2 years between the start of my data collection, which was the second year anniversary, and the beginning of the disaster.
What specifically were you looking for or looking at?
As a sociologist, what I do is a systematic study to identify patterns. So I came into it thinking that it would be very interesting to look at how risk was constructed. How did these various media construct the notion of risk, and how did it get particular kinds of meaning? And that began a really long coding process that I used NVivo, which is a systematic online way of looking for where the word risk might appear or associated words, and that's going from there more deeply into the articles to understand how they were being used, what was the context of their use.
So when you say you were looking for risk, you were actually searching for that word in the context of articles and news stories about Fukushima?
Exactly. There is so much data here that what I wanted to focus on for the first article out of this data is just the construction of risk with regard to the general population. I was really surprised when I saw how rarely that was discussed in media. So I think that out of almost 2,200 articles just about, that there were really only 129 across all of these media that talked about risk to populations at all. That's shocking. The rest of it was risk to economies, risk to markets, risk to energy, but there were not really many articles at all that talked about the human aspect of this, except where workers were concerned. So it made it seem like if you were not a worker, you wouldn't be at high risk.
And what was your understanding of the actual risk that the population faced as a result of this disaster?
I'm not someone who studies nuclear energy, and I'm not an expert on radiation. So I'm coming at this in a very odd way. I understand that what happened at Fukushima was far more devastating than what happened at Chernobyl, but I don't have the expertise to say what the consequences of that would be. I can only tell you how media represent the potential consequences. So, for example, most of the articles of that 129, 65 of them said, the risk here is really low. You are actually, and the New York Times ran an article saying, you're more at risk from radiation from rocks and cosmic rays from the environment than you are from anything happening at Fukushima. Well, that's pretty shocking. That's the kind of reporting that was going on. The articles that said, well, there's some low risk here, but, we can't really say that much about it. They compared the risk of cancer to walking through the X-ray machines at airports, right? That those were more dangerous than what was happening at Fukushima.
One of the quotes that came from the article is that research shows that corporations and government agencies had disproportionate access to framing the event in the media.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So when I look across all of these articles and I look at who's being quoted and in what context, so most of the time you could find quotes from government officials, from various corporations, but what you really missed were quotes from people on the ground, from anti-nuclear groups, from organizations that are generally more critical of nuclear power.
What do you think was behind this being the chosen narrative? Did it feel to you like it may have been a top-down decision, an edict from management or even higher government saying, play this down? Do you think it was ignorance on the part of the reporters to find contrasting views? Where do you think the failure to communicate more the seriousness of the risk came from?
I couldn't say that there is a single point at work here. It certainly isn't a top-down. In the U.S., we have a free media. You can report on whatever you want to report on. And yet, if you look at the dominant media outlets, they report the same stories in pretty much the same way every single day. You would think for that level of consistency that there was coercion somewhere. It doesn't work. That process in the U.S. doesn't work the same way that it might work in another country where there is literally a top-down coercive force. But rather, I think that it's a confluence of a lot of people who are involved in, who have access to the media, how we think about it. So of these 129 articles, only 3 of them were critical about this discourse of minimal risk. 3. So we have an original group of over 2,100 articles, 2,200 almost, and out of those, 3 are critical of how it's being reported. That's pretty shocking. That happens without someone coming through and saying, this is what you have to do, right? There's a whole different process at work when corporate media, and here we have Huffington and Politico included in this. I was thinking that there might be something much more edgy, more confrontational there. But no, that wasn't the case.
We do know from certain private channels that certainly there was pressure put on the United States, and the U.S. agreed to downplay the story. That came from a trade agreement that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, signed approximately 1 month after the disaster began. I've also heard from private contact that there was pressure put certainly on National Public Radio, and I can't say the specifics on it, but certainly the will of the government was made known that it needed to be downplayed and that there were certain pressures put on that made it difficult for the reports to come out in, shall we say, a less biased and a more focused on risk kind of a way.
In one instance, I know of a news reporter for an NPR station who was specifically told not to use the word fallout in connection with Fukushima. The word could only be used in connection with the repercussions of a political mistake that got made, like somebody showing their private parts on a cell phone photo. For those of us who are following the issue very closely and following the day-by-day, almost minute-by-minute progression of Fukushima in those early days, what was remarkable is that for about 3 days, there were a lot of reports in the U.S. media talking about the plume of radiation from Fukushima coming towards the United States, the West Coast, and that it was going to hit in approximately 8 days. For about 3 days, we heard that story, and then it vanished. It was nowhere. The word plume was not used, and there was no discussion of radiation hitting the West Coast, even though we know from our own readings at the time that it did hit, and it was specifically very intense in the Seattle area, where people were getting hot particles that were coming across from Fukushima. But it did not appear in the media after the third day. So it was suspected that something came down. We just haven't been able to nail with multiple sources so that it can be reported in a larger way what it was that actually happened.
I certainly found articles that reported that radiation from Fukushima was found in Vermont, articles that tracked that across the country. So I have a different experience. I'm not seeing that there's a blackout of news, but rather it's minimized. It's like no consequence.